The peppermint tea had gone lukewarm, but I kept my fingers wrapped around the ceramic mug anyway. It was the only source of warmth in the small sunroom. The door to the kitchen was left ajar, just a crack, because the old brass latch didn't catch unless you slammed it. Through that narrow gap, the voices of my children drifted in, carried on the draft that always smelled faintly of lemon wax and old newspapers. The cemetery in Oak Grove has a 3-year waiting list for the plots near the willow trees, Teresa said. Her voice had that specific brisk efficiency she used when she was organizing her pantry or scheduling her husband's root canals. If we don't reserve the space now, Mitchell, we're going to end up with a plot facing the highway. You know how she hates traffic. She won't listening to the traffic, Teresa, Mitchell replied. I heard the scrape of a kitchen chair, the heavy, familiar thud of his elbows hitting the oak table. The same table I had polished every Sunday for 42 years. And besides, Oak Grove is nearly double the cost of the memorial park near the bypass. We have to be practical. Dad didn't leave as much of a cushion as we thought, and her pension barely covers the oil heating for this drafty place. We aren't putting her near the bypass, Teresa snapped, though her tone lacked any real anger. It was more like the mild irritation of a project manager dealing with a minor budget variance. The bypass is dusty. People will see it when they drive in for the service. It looks cheap. I sat very still. A gray squirrel hopped onto the bird feeder outside the window, its claws scratching against the rusted tin. I didn't move to shoo it away. For the last 5 years since my husband Calvin passed, my world had shrunk to the boundaries of this yard, this chair, and the quiet expectation of my family's weekly visits. They came every Sunday afternoon. They brought groceries I didn't ask for, low-sodium crackers, canned soups with labels that screamed about heart health, and they took away my garbage. They spoke to me in the loud, slow cadence people use for foreigners or children. I had always thought they did it because they loved me and were afraid of losing me. I had tolerated the condescension because it was wrapped in the guise of care. But listening to them now, with the winter light fading across the threadbare carpet, I realized they weren't afraid of losing me at all. They were simply waiting for the other shoe to drop, and they were tired of holding their breath. What about the service itself? Mitchell asked. The sound of a pen clicking repeated 3 times. It was his nervous habit, one he'd had since he was a boy studying for his SATs at this very table. Are we doing a full viewing or just the graveside? Graveside is shorter, Teresa said. And we wouldn't have to worry about the cosmetic fees. You know how her skin has gotten lately. So paper thin. The mortician would charge an arm and a leg just to make her look presentable. That's true, Mitchell murmured. And honestly, who would come? Most of her friends from the garden club are either in facilities or gone. It would just be us, the kids, and maybe Cousin Joanne if she's in town. A full service feels unnecessary. The word hung in the air, drifting through the crack in the door to settle over my cold tea. I looked down at my hands. They were spotted with age, the knuckles swollen from arthritic winters, the skin indeed translucent enough that I could see the blue map of my veins running beneath it. These were the hands that had scrubbed Mitchell's grass-stained knees after his Little League games, the hands that had braided Teresa's thick, stubborn hair every morning before school, until she was old enough to tell me. My touch was too tight. I had spent 34 years working the reference desk at the township library, lifting heavy crates of donated books, writing down search queries for people who had nowhere else to look for answers. I had lived a life of quiet utility. I had made myself useful so that I would be kept. We should probably start sorting through the attic before spring, Teresa said, her voice dropping slightly, though not enough to suggest she was worried about being overheard. There's so much junk up there. All those boxes of Calvin's old slide projectors and her sewing patterns from the 70s. If we do it a little at a time, we won't have to rush when the time comes. She's going to notice if we start hauling boxes down, Teresa, Mitchell said. No, she won't. She spends half her day in that sunroom staring at the maple tree. Half the time I don't think she even knows what month it is. Yesterday I asked her if she wanted the curtains drawn, and she just nodded without looking at me. I closed my eyes. I remembered that moment from yesterday. I hadn't looked at Teresa because the light on the maple tree was a very specific pale silver that only occurs right before a heavy frost. I had been trying to hold that color in my mind, to remember it, because my world had so few colors left. I hadn't been confused. I had simply been quiet. But to them, my silence was a vacancy. It was an invitation to begin the salvage operation, while the vessel was still afloat. Just don't touch the cedar chest in her bedroom yet, Mitchell added. She keeps the deed to the cabin in there. We'll need that settled before we can do anything with the property. I know where the deed is, Teresa said, her voice tightening with a sudden sharp edge of greed that she quickly smoothed over. I'm not stupid, Mitchell. I'm the one who's been handling her prescription refills every month. I know exactly what's in that chest. A cold weight settled in my stomach, not the sharp pain of sudden betrayal, but the heavy, dull ache of a truth I had spent years pretending not to see. My children did not hate me. That would have required an emotional expenditure they weren't willing to make. No, it was worse than that. They had simply filed me away under pending. I was a chore that had to be maintained until it could be properly archived. I stood up. My knees made a dry popping sound in the silence of the sunroom. I took my teacup in both hands, ensuring my grip was steady, and walked toward the kitchen door. As my hand touched the brass knob, I heard the sudden frantic rustle of paper from the kitchen, the sound of Mitchell folding up his legal pad, the squeak of Teresa's rubber-soled shoes as she stood up to look busy. "Oh, Mom!" Teresa's voice instantly rose an octave, bright and fragile as cheap glass. "You're awake. We were just talking about what to do for your birthday next month. Mitchell thinks we should do a nice dinner here. But I was thinking maybe we could take you out to that tea room you like in Dover." She stood by the stove, her hands clasped in front of her, her face fixed in an expression of intense simulated warmth. Mitchell was leaning against the counter, his thumb hovering over his phone screen, his eyes skating over my shoulder, looking at anything but my face. "A tea room," I said. My voice sounded small to my own ears, dry and unused, like an old book opened after years in a cellar. "Yes," Teresa smiled, her eyes wide and unblinking. "The one with the little cucumber sandwiches. You loved that place last year. I had hated it. The tea was always lukewarm, and the chairs were too low for my back. But I had smiled and thanked them, because they had gone to the trouble of driving me there. "That sounds very nice," I said softly. I walked over to the sink and carefully poured the remainder of my cold peppermint tea down the drain. I watched the dark liquid swirl around the rusted metal strainer before disappearing. "Are you feeling all right, Mom?" Mitchell asked, his voice carrying that familiar, practiced tone of filial concern. "You look a little pale today. Did you take your midday pill?" "I took it, Mitchell," I said, keeping my back to them as I rinsed the cup. "I'm just a little tired. The wind is coming from the north today." "Well, make sure you keep the thermostat up," Teresa said, reaching for her purse on the counter. "We're going to head out before the traffic on the bypass gets too bad. But I'll call you on Tuesday to check on your grocery list." "Thank you, dear," I said. I turned to watch them leave. They moved quickly now, their departures always characterized by a sudden, energetic momentum that they never showed when arriving. They kissed my cheek, brief, dry brushes of skin that smelled of expensive hand lotion and car upholstery. And then they were gone, the heavy oak front door clicking shut behind them. I stood in the center of the quiet kitchen. The house was very still now, save for the rhythmic, hollow tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. I walked over to the kitchen table. Mitchell had cleared away his legal pad, but in his haste he had left behind a small yellow sticky note stuck to the edge of the wood. Written in his hurried, slanted handwriting were 3 words, "Oak Grove Cost." I picked up the note. I didn't tear it. I didn't cry. Instead, I folded it neatly into a small, tight square and slipped it into the pocket of my cardigan. Children rarely notice a mother disappearing until something they need disappears with her. They believed they were preparing for my end. What they didn't understand was that I was about to change the beginning of theirs. The night after they left, the silence in the house felt different. Usually the quietness was a blanket, soft and familiar, a welcome relief after the performance of being mom for 3 hours. But tonight it felt like cold water rising slowly around my ankles. I sat in the kitchen until the refrigerator kicked on, its low mechanical hum vibrating through the floorboards. On the counter sat the small plastic pill organizer Teresa had bought me. It was blue, with the days of the week printed in white letters that had begun to rub off from her vigorous wiping. She disinfected everything when she came over, as if old age were a virus she could catch from the linoleum. I walked down the narrow hallway to my bedroom. The floorboards groaned under my slippers, a sound I usually avoided by stepping near the baseboards, a habit left over from the decades when Calvin worked the night shift, and I had to keep the children quiet. Now there was no one to wake, yet the habit remained. We carry the ghosts of our obligations long after the duties themselves have ended. At the foot of my bed sat the cedar chest. It was heavy, made of solid aromatic red cedar, with brass corners that had darkened to the color of wet earth. My father had built it for me when I married Calvin in 1971. For 50 years, it had held the things too precious for daily life. My wedding veil, the handmade lace christening gown, both Mitchell and Teresa had worn, Calvin's discharge papers from the Navy, and a small velvet-lined box containing 3 silver baby spoons. I knelt beside it. The arthritis in my left knee flared, a sharp, hot needle of protest, but I ignored it. I reached under the fringe of the bedskirt to find the small brass key I kept taped to the rear leg of the nightstand. The lock turned with a dry metallic click. As the heavy lid swung open, the scent of cedar rushed out, dry, clean, and redolent of a time when everything in my life was still ahead of me. I dug past the layers of tissue paper and yellowed linen until my fingers found the thick, textured paper of the manila envelope at the very bottom. I pulled it out and sat on the floor, my back against the bed. Inside the envelope was the deed to the cabin in Wisconsin, near a quiet stretch of water called Lost Land Lake. Calvin and I had bought the land in 1978 for $4,000. It was mostly birch trees and swamp back then. Over 30 summers, Calvin and I had cleared the brush, poured the concrete footer, and built the cabin ourselves, log by hand-peeled log. It was where Mitchell had caught his first bluegill. It was where Teresa had spent her teenage summers sulking on the dock with a paperback novel, pretending she didn't want to be there, though she always cried on the drive back to the suburbs. Now, according to the tax assessment buried behind the deed, the land alone was worth nearly $300,000. The lake had become fashionable. People from Chicago were buying up the old fishing shacks, tearing them down, and building 3-story glass monstrosities with heated driveways. I stared at the deed. On the second page, in clean, typed print, were the names of the beneficiaries Calvin and I had listed 20 years ago. Mitchell James Miller and Teresa Joanne Miller, to share equally upon the death of the survivor. They knew about this document. Of course they did. Mitchell had helped me file the property taxes 2 years ago after Calvin died, his eyes lingering on the assessment form just a second too long. A woman can spend 40 years building a home, raising children, and smoothing over the rough edges of a family, only to realize she has become nothing more than a legal obstacle between them and a piece of real estate. I folded the paper back into the envelope. My hands were shaking, not from weakness, but from a strange, cold clarity that had begun to take root in my chest. The next morning, Monday, the telephone rang at precisely 9:15. It was Teresa. This was part of our arrangement. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, she called at 9:15 to check if I had taken my blood pressure medication and to see if I needed her to order my groceries online. Usually I answered on the second ring. I would tell her I was fine, thank her for her concern, and listen to her complain about her husband's back or her daughter's volleyball coach for 20 minutes. It was the price I paid for her attention. This time I let it ring. The sound was loud in the empty kitchen. 1, 2, 3, 4. On the 5th ring, the answering machine on the counter clicked. Teresa's voice filled the room, slightly distorted by the cheap speaker, her tone already carrying that thin, sharp edge of impatience she tried so hard to hide. "Mom, are you there? Pick up if you're there. I know you're probably just in the yard, but you really shouldn't be out there without your phone. Mitchell says we need to get you one of those medical alert buttons. And honestly, if you aren't going to answer." I stood by the sink, holding a damp sponge, watching the indicator light on the machine blink red. "Anyway, call me back when you get this. I have a busy afternoon." Don't forget your blue pill." The machine clicked off. The silence returned, heavier this time, but lighter too. Some people confuse unconditional love with permanent access. They assume that because a mother has spent her life accommodating their schedules, their whims, and their convenience, she has no interior life of her own, no threshold where her patience ends and her dignity begins. I set the sponge down. For the first time in 2 years, I didn't immediately call her back to apologize for missing her call. I didn't draft an explanation about being in the basement or having my hands in dishwater. Instead, I walked to the telephone desk in the hall. From the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of old phone books and take-out menus, I pulled out a small, leather-bound address book with a frayed spine. I flipped through the yellowed pages to the letter V. Vance, Roy. Roy was the son of our old family attorney, Curtis Vance, who had retired to Florida a decade ago. Roy had taken over his father's practice in the town square. He was a quiet man, a few years younger than Mitchell, who still wore his father's old-fashioned wool suits, and spoke with the slow, deliberate cadence of someone who knew the value of silence. I lifted the receiver. The dial tone was a clean, steady hum in my ear. "Roy?" I said when his receptionist put me through. "This is Sylvia Miller, Calvin's wife, Mrs. Miller." Roy's voice was warm, lacking the hurried efficiency of my children. "It's good to hear from you. How are you holding up?" "I'm holding up, Roy," I said, looking out the window at the maple tree. The silver leaves were gone now, leaving the branches bare and dark against the gray sky. "I'd like to come into the office this week. I need to make some changes to my estate planning." There was a brief pause on the line, hardly more than a breath, but I caught it. Roy was a lawyer. He knew what a widow's sudden phone call usually meant. "Of course," he said quietly. "I have an opening on Thursday morning at 10. Would that work for you?" "That works perfectly," I said. "And Roy?" "I'd appreciate it if we kept this between us for now. The children are very busy with their own lives, and I don't want to worry them." "Understood, Mrs. Miller," Roy replied. "I'll see you Thursday." I hung up the phone. My heart wasn't racing. My hands were perfectly steady. I looked at the grandfather clock in the hall. It was 9:30. In 30 minutes, Mitchell would be calling from his office to complain about his commute and ask if I had received the new furnace filter he had ordered. I walked to the front door, turned the deadbolt, and did something I hadn't done in years. I slipped my coat on, took my purse, and walked out of the house without leaving a note. My Buick LeSabre was 10 years old, but it had only 38,000 miles on it. Calvin had always kept it washed and serviced, and after he died I had insisted on keeping it, despite Mitchell's suggestions that we sell it to save on the insurance. He had argued that between his car and Teresa's SUV, they could easily drive me wherever I needed to go. Wherever I needed to go. They had defined those parameters very narrowly. The pharmacy, the grocery store on Tuesdays, and the doctor's office. Anything beyond that was deemed unnecessary travel. But as I turned the key, the engine caught with a low, familiar rumble that felt like a quiet victory. The steering wheel was cold beneath my bare hands. I had forgotten my gloves in my haste, but I didn't care. I backed down the driveway, my eyes on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Teresa's white Suburban tank pulling in to block my escape. I drove to the Bluebird Diner on the edge of town. It was a low-slung brick building with neon beer signs in the window that had been there since the 60s. Calvin and I used to come here on Friday nights after my shift at the library. We would sit in the back booth, share a plate of onion rings, and talk about the cabin. We had been so young then, so full of plans that didn't involve doctors or legal documents. The diner was mostly empty at 10 in the morning. A few truck drivers sat at the counter, and an elderly couple in the corner booth was sharing a newspaper in comfortable silence. I took a seat near the window, ordering a black coffee and a piece of dry toast from a young waitress whose name tag read Brittany. She looked at me with the same mild, dismissive kindness my children used, but without the underlying calculation. To her, I was just an old lady spending her morning cup of coffee. I preferred it that way. I looked out at the parking lot. The sun had broken through the gray clouds, casting a harsh, flat light over the asphalt. I thought about Mitchell's phone call, the one I had ignored. He would be at his desk now, surrounded by his dual monitors and Excel spreadsheets, his phone tucked between his shoulder and his ear as he talked to his shipping coordinators. He prided himself on his control. He was a man who managed logistics. But people are not freight. They do not move along predictable routes just because you have drawn a line on a map. When I returned home at noon, the red light on my answering machine wasn't just blinking. It was flashing with a frantic double-beat rhythm. There were 3 messages. The first was from Mitchell, recorded at 10:15. "Mom, Teresa said she couldn't get a hold of you. I just tried the house phone and it went to voicemail. Are you there? Give me a call back as soon as you get this. We're just making sure you're okay." The second was from Teresa at 11:10, her voice sharper now, the performance of polite concern beginning to wear thin. "Mom, this isn't funny. I called the neighbor, Mrs. Gable, and she said, 'Your car isn't in the driveway. Where are you? You shouldn't be driving in this wind. Call me immediately.'" The third was Mitchell again 10 minutes ago. His voice was lower, more deliberate. "Mom, I'm leaving the office early. I'll be over there around 1 to check on things. Just stay put if you're back." I looked at the kitchen clock. It was 12:40. I had 20 minutes. I didn't panic. I went into the bathroom, washed my hands with the lavender soap Teresa had bought me for Mother's Day, and dried them on the linen towel. Then I went into the living room, sat in my armchair, and waited. At exactly 1:15, the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway signaled his arrival. Mitchell didn't knock. He had a key, a spare I had given him, in case of emergencies. The door opened with a sudden rush of cold air, and his heavy footsteps hurried down the hall. "Mom," he called out, his voice tense. "In here, Mitchell," I said quietly. He appeared in the archway, his wool coat unbuttoned, his tie slightly askew. He looked around the room quickly, his eyes darting to the floor, the tables, the corners, as if searching for physical evidence of my decline. He was breathing heavily, though he had only walked 20 feet from his car. "Where were you?" he asked. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation dressed in the garments of worry. Teresa was frantic. I had to leave a meeting with our regional director. "I was out, Mitchell," I said. keeping my hands folded in my lap. I needed some air. Out where? Your car was gone. You didn't answer the phone. He took off his leather gloves, slapping them against his palm. We have an agreement, Mom. You're supposed to let us know if you're leaving the house. What if you had an accident? What if your blood pressure spiked while you were driving? My blood pressure is perfectly fine, I said, and I don't recall signing an agreement about my movements. Mitchell blinked. He wasn't used to me speaking to him with this level of directness. For years, my responses to his lectures had been limited to "I'm sorry, dear," or "I'll be more careful next time." He softened his tone, though his eyes remained tight. He sat down on the sofa opposite me, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, the classic posture of a man preparing to negotiate with a difficult client. "We're just worried about you, Mom," he said, his voice dropping to a warm, fraternal register. "That's all. We love you, and we don't want anything to happen to you. This house, it's a lot for you to manage alone. We've been talking, and we really think it might be time to start looking at some other options. Something smaller, where you don't have to worry about the maintenance." "Like an apartment?" I asked. "Or a community," he said quickly, his eyes lighting up now that he thought he had found an opening. "A place with activities and transport and, well, people your own age. And if we sold this place, and maybe the cabin, we could secure a really nice spot for you. The cabin is just sitting there, Mom. Nobody's used it since Dad died, and the taxes are only going up. It's a liability, a liability." That was what they called the logs Calvin and I had carried on our shoulders. That was what they called the lake where he had taught them to swim. A liability. "The cabin has been paid for since 1985, Mitchell," I said softly. "The taxes are $1,200 a year. I can afford that." "For now," Mitchell said, his voice tightening again. "But what happens when the roof needs to be replaced? What happens when the dock rots out? You're 71, Mom. You need to be practical. We're trying to protect your assets so you have enough to live comfortably." He didn't say "so we have something left when you're gone." But the words were there, written in the air between us, as clearly as if he had scrawled them on his yellow legal pad. A child's worry for an aging parent is often just a polite word for the fear of being inconvenienced by their survival. They wanted me safe. Yes, but more than that, they wanted me settled, packaged, and filed away so they could begin the business of dividing up the remains. "I'll think about it," I said, giving him the answer I knew would make him stop talking. He stood up, looking pleased with himself. He believed he had made progress. He believed the old woman was finally beginning to bend under the weight of his logic. "Good," he said, patting my shoulder through the thick wool of his coat. "That's all we ask. Just think about it. I'm going to go up to the attic and look for those old winter tires Calvin kept up there. Teresa wants me to clear some space while I'm here." He turned toward the hallway stairs. I sat in my chair, listening to his heavy steps ascend to the attic, the wood creaking under his weight. He was already beginning the inventory. But he didn't know that the lock on the cedar chest had already been turned, and the key was no longer under the bed. Above my head, the ceiling groaned as Mitchell moved from one side of the attic to the other. I sat beneath the dining room light, watching tiny golden specks of dust drift down through the air, disturbed by his footsteps. They caught the pale winter light before settling onto the polished surface of the table. Every thump, every scraping sound of cardboard against the dusty pine floorboards felt like a small physical blow to the house itself. Up there in the dark corners under the rafters was the paper trail of our lives. There were boxes of high school yearbooks, the hand-painted wooden blocks Calvin had carved for Mitchell's 3rd birthday, and 3 decades of tax returns wrapped in kitchen twine. To me, that attic was a museum of small, quiet sacrifices. To Mitchell, it was simply 30 square yards of clutter standing between him and a clean estate sale. After 40 minutes, the scraping stopped. His heavy footsteps descended the wooden pull-down stairs, accompanied by a low, frustrated grunt. He emerged into the hallway, his face flushed and his expensive blue dress shirt marked with 2 gray streaks of dust across the shoulder. He was carrying a small green metal tackle box, Calvin's old fishing kit, and a stack of dusty ledger books. "I couldn't find the tires," Mitchell said, wiping his forehead with the back of his arm. "But I found these old ledgers of Dad's from the hardware store. Honestly, Mom, I don't know why you're keeping these. The business closed in '98. They're just taking up space." "They have your father's handwriting in them," I said softly. Mitchell looked down at the faded green canvas covers in his hands, his expression a mix of impatience and mild discomfort. He didn't open them. He didn't look at the neat blue ink columns where Calvin had recorded the price of nails and kerosene 40 years ago. "Yeah, well," he murmured, setting them on the edge of the dining table. "It's still junk, logically speaking. We need to start getting rid of this stuff. If we have to clear this house out in a hurry later, it's going to be a nightmare. In a hurry." He didn't say when you die, but the timeline was clear enough. "And I wanted to check the cedar chest in your bedroom," Mitchell continued, his eyes shifting toward the hallway. "I thought Dad's old silver coin collection might be in there. Teresa said she couldn't find the key when she was looking for your medical records last month." I felt a small, cold twitch in my chest. So Teresa had already been searching my bedroom while I was down in the kitchen making her tea. They had been testing the locks, quiet as mice, while my back was turned. "The key is lost, Mitchell," I said, my voice steady, my face perfectly expressionless. "I haven't seen it since the funeral. I think your father must have misplaced it." Mitchell frowned, his thumb tapping against the metal handle of the tackle box. "We could just pry the lock off. It's an old brass latch. Wouldn't take much to pop it open with a flathead screwdriver." "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it had a weight that made him stop tapping. He looked at me, surprised by the sudden cool firmness in my tone. "I don't want it broken," I said, looking him in the eye. "It was a gift from my father. Leave it be." He held my gaze for a second, then looked away, clearing his throat. "Right, sure. Just thought we should inventory the valuables, that's all. For the insurance." "I have all the insurance I need," I said. He checked his watch, his posture shifting back to that of a busy man with places to be. "Well, I have to get back to the office. The East Coast shipment is coming in at 3. Teresa will be by on Wednesday to bring you those low-sodium soups." Try to keep your phone near you, Mom. We don't want another scare like this morning. I'll be right here, Mitchell, I said. I watched him walk out. He didn't take the dusty ledger books with him. He left them sitting on the polished oak table, a small pile of discarded history that he had deemed worthless. After his car pulled out of the driveway, I walked over to the table. I opened the top ledger. The paper was yellowed at the edges, smelling of cedar and dry ink. On the first page, in Calvin's neat architectural hand, was an entry from October 1974. 3 rolls of tar paper, 2 kegs of roofing nails. For the porch. We had built that porch together, while Teresa was still crawling on the living room rug. I remembered the smell of the wet pine, the taste of the lemonade I had made in the blue pitcher, and the way Calvin had laughed when he accidentally hammered his thumb. We had built our lives out of those small, ordinary moments. We had saved. We had scrimped. We had gone without new coats or vacations so that our children would have a college education and a down payment for their first homes. We had given them everything we had, believing that love was a reciprocal ledger, that the care you pour into a child eventually returns to you when your own strength begins to fail. But human ledger books do not always balance. Sometimes the more you give, the more they believe they are owed. Unconditional love to a selfish child looks very much like a permanent line of credit. On Wednesday, Teresa didn't show up. At 12:30, she sent a text message, stuck at the dentist with Avery. We'll bring the soups on Friday. Make sure you eat some lunch. I didn't reply. I didn't feel angry. I felt a strange, quiet sense of relief. It was one less performance I had to give. One less afternoon of pretending I didn't see the way her eyes lingered on the silver tea service in the china cabinet, calculating its scrap value. That night I didn't cook. I sat in the dark living room, watching the headlights of passing cars sweep across the ceiling. I thought about my appointment with Roy Vance the next morning. I had spent the afternoon gathering my papers. Not just the cabin deed, but my bank savings book, my modest retirement account statements from the library pension, and the deed to this very house. My children believed I was living on the edge of poverty, that I was a financial burden they would soon have to carry. They didn't know that Calvin had left a small life insurance policy that Mitchell had never found, or that I had been quietly depositing my library pension check into a separate account for 10 years, living only on Calvin's Social Security. I had nearly $80,000 in that account. It wasn't a fortune, but it was mine. It was my independence, wrapped in a black plastic checkbook cover at the bottom of my underwear drawer. They thought I was a ghost haunting their future inheritance. But tomorrow I was going to rewrite the story. Thursday morning arrived with a hard silver frost that turned the lawn into a field of tiny frozen needles. I took my time getting dressed. I didn't wear my usual faded house dress or the comfortable oversized cardigan with the stretched-out pockets. Instead, I went to the back of the closet and pulled out my navy blue wool suit. It was the suit I had bought for Calvin's funeral 2 years ago. I had only worn it once since then, to a retirement dinner for one of my former colleagues at the library. As I brushed a stray piece of lint from the collar, I looked at myself in the vanity mirror. The woman looking back at me was older, Certainly, with deep lines etched on her mouth and eyes that looked small-sore behind her reading glasses. But there was a firmness in her jaw that I hadn't seen in a very long time. For years I had allowed my posture to shrink, to mimic the frailty my children expected of me. Today I stood up straight. The town square was quiet at 10 o'clock. The old brick courthouse sat in the center of the lawn, its bronze statue of a Civil War soldier dusted with a light coating of frost. Roy Vance's office was located above the pharmacy on the east side of the square. The wooden stairs creaked in a slow, rhythmic scale as I climbed them, a sound that brought back a sudden sharp memory of coming here with Calvin 40 years ago to sign our first mortgage. The air in the stairwell still smelled of cough syrup, old paper, and floor wax. Roy was waiting for me. He stood up from his heavy mahogany desk, smoothing the front of his gray wool suit. He looked remarkably like his father, Curtis. He had the same high forehead and the same gentle, slightly sorrowful eyes of a man who had spent his life watching his neighbors divide up their parents' secrets. "Mrs. Miller," he said, coming around the desk to shake my hand. His grip was warm and respectful. "Thank you for coming in. Please, sit down." I took the leather armchair opposite his desk. I placed my black vinyl purse on my lap and unzipped it, pulling out the neat stack of manila envelopes I had prepared the night before. "I appreciate you seeing me on such short notice, Roy," I said, placing the envelopes on the polished wood between us. "I know you're a busy man." "Never too busy for you, Sylvia," he said, using my first name for the first time, a subtle shift that acknowledged the gravity of why I was here. "What can I do for you?" I pushed the first envelope toward him. "This is the deed to the house here in town. And this," I pushed the second one, is the deed to the cabin at Lost Land Lake. I also have my bank savings book, my library pension details, and my current medical directive." Roy didn't touch the envelopes immediately. He looked at them, then looked up at me, his eyes searching my face with a quiet, professional curiosity. "Mitchell and Teresa," he said softly. "I assume they don't know you're here?" "They don't," I replied, "and they won't until the paperwork is finalized. My children are. Well, they are very organized, Roy. They have already begun to plan my funeral. They have also begun to calculate the market value of my home and the cabin. They believe my life is a ledger that is ready to be closed." Roy's face didn't change, but his eyes softened with a look of quiet, familiar disappointment. He had seen this story before. "Every lawyer in a small town has." "I see," he murmured. "And what is it you want to do, Sylvia?" "I want to place both the house and the cabin into an irrevocable living trust," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I want the trust to be managed by your firm as the independent trustee, not my children." Roy leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers drumming lightly against the armrest. "An irrevocable trust is a very serious step, Sylvia. It means you are transferring ownership of these properties to the trust. You won't be able to sell them or borrow against them without the trustee's deeds. Though, of course, as long as you are living, you have the absolute right to reside in the house and use the cabin." "That is exactly what I want," I said. "I want to ensure that as long as I am breathing, no one can sell this house out from under me to pay for a care facility I do not want to enter. And I want to ensure that the cabin cannot be listed by a real estate agent the moment my heart stops beating. And after you pass? Roy asked. What are the terms of the trust then? I took a deep breath. This was the part I had spent the night rehearsing, the part that had kept me awake until the birds began to chirp in the maple tree. When I am gone, I said, the house may be sold, and the proceeds divided equally between Mitchell and Teresa. But the cabin is different. If either of them wants to keep it, they must buy out the other's share at full market value, and the property must remain in the family. If they both agree to sell it, the entire proceeds of the sale will not go to them. Roy raised an eyebrow. Where would they go? To the county library's Children's Literacy Fund, I said. For 34 years, I watched children learn to read in that building. I watched them discover worlds they could never afford to visit. If my children do not want Calvin's logs and Calvin's lake, then they will not have his money either. Let it go to the children who actually need a place to dream. Roy sat in silence for a long moment. He looked down at the manila envelopes, then picked up the cabin deed, turning the yellowed pages with a slow, respectful touch. This is a very powerful document, Sylvia, he said quietly. It completely strips Mitchell and Teresa of any leverage they thought they had over your remaining years. They won't be able to force you into a home. They won't be able to use the cabin as collateral for their own debts. You are locking the door from the inside. I have spent 50 years unlocking doors for them, Roy, I said. It is time I locked one for myself. And your savings? He asked, looking at the bank book. The $79,000? I want $40,000 of it placed into the trust to cover the maintenance of the cabin and the house taxes for the next 10 years, I said. The rest I am keeping in my personal checking account. I intend to spend it. Roy smiled then, a genuine, warm smile that creased the corners of his eyes. On what, if I may ask? I don't know yet, I said. And for the first time in 2 years, a small, genuine laugh escaped my throat. Perhaps a trip. Perhaps a new sofa that isn't covered in the plastic slipcovers Teresa bought me. I'll think of something. All right, Roy said, drawing a yellow legal pad toward him and uncapping his pen. I'll draft the trust agreement and the new deeds today. It will take about a week to get everything registered with the county. I'll need you to come back next Thursday at the same to sign. I will be here, I said. There is a quiet hidden power in a pen. For 50 years, my hands had worked to clean, to cook, to soothe, and to carry. But today they only needed to sign a single line of blue ink to undo all of my children's expectations. I stood up, shaking Roy's hand, and walked out of the office. The cold air of the town square hit my face, crisp and sharp, but it didn't make me shiver. I felt warm. I felt light. I walked down the creaking stairs and out onto the sidewalk. I reached into my purse to find my car keys, and as I did, my fingers brushed against my phone. It was vibrating. I pulled it out. The screen showed a photo of Teresa, her face smiling in a frozen digital performance of happiness. I stood on the sidewalk, the Civil War statue watching me from across the street, and watched the phone ring. I didn't answer. I put the phone back in my purse, zipped it shut, and walked toward my Buick. Friday afternoon arrived, and with it, the low, heavy rumble of Teresa's white SUV idling in the driveway. I sat at the dining room table, a cup of Earl Grey tea steaming in front of me. I had decided against the peppermint. I was tired of the taste of digestion aids and mild choices. Today, I wanted something with a bit of a bite. On the table before me lay Calvin's ledger books, exactly where Mitchell had left them. But I had opened the top one to the year 1982, the year Teresa was born. On that page, in Calvin's neat, architectural hand, were the expenses for her nursery: white pine crib, 6 gallons of pale pink paint, brass stroller wheels. Beside the figures, Calvin had drawn a tiny, perfect sketch of a wooden blocks tower. He had been so proud of her. He had believed, as young fathers do, that he was building a sanctuary that would shelter her forever. The kitchen door opened with its usual violent rattle, followed by the heavy, hurried thump of Teresa's rubber-soled winter boots. "Mom." "I'm here," she called out, her voice carrying that high, slightly strained register of someone who was already behind schedule. "I've got the soups." I had to go to 3 different stores to find the low-sodium split pea. Honestly, the grocery store in town has gone completely downhill. She marched into the dining room, carrying a heavy cardboard box filled with green and yellow cans. She set it on the sideboard with a sharp thud, then stopped, her eyes instantly falling on the ledger books open on the table. She frowned. "What are these doing down here? I thought Mitchell told you we were going to recycle these." "They're absolutely covered in dust, Mom." "You shouldn't have them in the dining room. It's terrible for your asthma." "My asthma has been gone for 10 years, Teresa," I said, taking a slow sip of my tea. "And these are not junk. They are your father's records." Teresa sighed, a long, dramatic exhalation that she usually reserved for when her teenage daughter, Avery, refused to clean her room. She walked over to the table and closed the ledger with a sharp, dismissive slap, sending a tiny cloud of gray dust into the air. "It's just paper, Mom," she said, her tone shifting to that of a patient nurse dealing with a difficult patient. "We have to be practical. If we don't start clearing some of this clutter out now, it's going to fall on me and Mitchell later. And we both have full-time jobs and families to manage. We can't be spending our weekends sorting through 40-year-old hardware receipts." "You don't have to sort through them," I said quietly. "I am perfectly capable of looking at them myself." Teresa looked at me then, her eyes narrowing slightly. She noticed the green wool cardigan I was wearing, the good one, the one I usually kept wrapped in tissue paper in my closet. She noticed the Earl Grey tea, and the fact that I hadn't immediately jumped up to unpack the groceries she had brought. "Are you feeling all right?" she asked, her voice dropping to a suspicious, protective register. "Mitchell said you were acting strange on Monday. He said you went out for a drive in the wind and didn't answer your phone." "I was having a cup of coffee at the Bluebird Diner," I said. "It was very peaceful." "The Bluebird?" Teresa's face twisted in mild disgust. "That place is filthy, Mom, and you shouldn't be driving out there alone. The highway is dangerous. If you wanted coffee, you should have called me. I would have brought you a Starbucks." "I didn't want a Starbucks," I said. "I wanted to sit in the booth, Calvin, and I used to sit in." Teresa made a quick, dismissive gesture with her hand, as if brushing away a fly. She didn't want to talk about Calvin. Memories were emotional liabilities. They slowed down the logistics of progress. Well, whatever, she said, walking toward the hallway. We really need to get that cedar chest open, Mom. Mitchell spoke to a listing agent yesterday, a friend of his from the Chamber of Commerce, and she said the cabin market is peaking right now. If we list it before the snow gets too heavy, we could have a cash buyer by the end of the year. But she needs to see the legal description on the deed. My fingers tightened around my teacup. They hadn't even waited for me to think about it. Mitchell had already contacted an agent. They were already spending the money in their minds, perhaps dividing it up between Avery's college tuition and a new kitchen remodel for Teresa's house. I have the deed taken care of, I said, keeping my voice level, my eyes fixed on the closed ledger book. Teresa stopped in the archway of the hall. She turned back to look at me, her purse clutched tightly in her hands. What do you mean? Taken care of? Where is it? Is it in the chest? It is in a safe place, I said. Mom, Teresa's voice took on a sharp, warning edge. This is important. Mitchell needs that document. If you've misplaced it, we need to know so we can order a certified copy from the county. We're just trying to help you. You make it sound like we're trying to steal from you. It's exhausting, really, having to manage your life when you're being so stubborn. She stood there, waiting for me to apologize. For 30 years, this had been her primary weapon. She would present her impatience as a sacrifice, demanding my gratitude for the labor of pushing me toward my own exit. If I didn't comply, she would accuse me of being difficult or ungrateful, and I, wanting only peace in my remaining years, would always give in. But today the guilt didn't come. Instead, I felt a strange, cool emptiness where my compliance used to be. I looked at her. My daughter, the girl I had stayed up with through 3 nights of scarlet fever, the woman who now saw me only as a series of chores to be managed. I am not stubborn, Teresa, I said softly. I am simply 71 years old, and I am still living in my own house. I do not require you to manage my life. Teresa's mouth opened slightly, then closed. Her face flushed a deep, angry red. She was not used to me speaking without an apology. She was not used to me standing my ground. Fine, she said, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed rage. If that's how you want to be. But don't call me when your heater goes out this winter, or when you can't get your prescriptions. Mitchell and I are doing the best we can, and if you're going to treat us like we're the enemy, then we'll just let you handle it yourself. Thank you, I said. I would prefer that. Teresa stared at me for 3 long seconds. She looked for a crack in my composure, some sign that I was about to burst into tears and beg her to stay. But I didn't. I simply took another sip of my Earl Grey tea. With a sharp, angry huff, Teresa turned on her heel and marched down the hall. The heavy oak front door slammed shut behind her, rattling the glass panes in the china cabinet. A second later, the roar of her SUV's engine shattered the quiet of the afternoon as she backed down the driveway. I sat alone in the quiet dining room. I looked at the cardboard box of low-sodium split-pea soup sitting on the sideboard. I knew I wouldn't eat a single can of it. I opened Calvin's ledger book back to the page from 1982. I ran my fingers over the neat blue columns of ink, over the sketch of the wooden blocks. We built it well, Calvin, I whispered to the empty room. But the sanctuary is ours now, not theirs. The weekend was a monument of silence. Normally, Sunday afternoon was the anchor of my week. It was the 3 hours when the house was filled with the clatter of Mitchell's heavy boots, the high-pitched chatter of Avery's voice as she complained about her friends, and the rhythmic, hollow thump of the kitchen cabinet doors being opened and closed as Teresa organized my pantry. I used to spend Saturday mornings baking, making apple pies or sugar cookies, believing that the scent of butter and sugar was the thread that kept them tied to this house. This Sunday, the driveway remained empty. There were no phone calls, no text messages, no hurried arrivals. It was the silent treatment, a classic maneuver from Teresa's playbook. She had used it on her husband during their first year of marriage. And she had used it on me when she was 16, and I wouldn't let her go to a beach party in Jersey. It was designed to starve the target of connection until they became desperate enough to offer an unconditional surrender. They thought the silence would frighten me. They thought I would look out the window at the empty road and feel the cold, terrifying weight of my own obsolescence. They forgot that when you have spent 40 years managing a household in the background, you are already an expert in silence. You know how to live inside it. You know how to listen to the house settling, the wind in the chimney, the quiet, steady beat of your own heart. Instead of baking, I did something I hadn't done since Calvin died. I put on an old record, Billie Holiday, her voice scratchy and sweet through the speakers of the mahogany stereo console in the living room. I made myself a proper lunch, a small pork chop with fried apples and real butter. I didn't eat it out of a plastic container over the sink. I sat at the dining room table, using the good china with the delicate gold rim, and I took my time. The food tasted better when it wasn't seasoned with the anxiety of their arrival. On Monday morning, the phone rang at exactly 10 o'clock. It wasn't Teresa, it was Mitchell. His voice was calm, measured, and carefully neutral. He was using his logistics manager voice, the one he used when a shipment of copper tubing was delayed in Chicago, and he had to pacify a regional distributor. "Mom," he said, skipping the usual inquiries about my health, "Teresa told me about the conversation you two had on Friday. She was pretty upset. You know she's under a lot of stress with Avery's college applications right now." "I'm sure she is," I said, leaning against the hallway wall, looking at the faded floral wallpaper. "Look, we need to talk about this cabin situation," Mitchell continued, his tone carrying a firm, paternal authority. "The listing agent called me back this morning. She has a buyer who's looking for a lakeside property to renovate before the spring. They're willing to make an all-cash offer, no contingencies. But we need that deed, Mom. We can't move forward without the legal description." "Mitchell," I said quietly, "I told Teresa, and now I am telling you. The cabin is not for sale." There was a long pause on the line. I heard the faint, metallic rustle of paper from his end, the sound of him adjusting his legal pad. "Mom," he said, his voice dropping to a lower, tighter register, "you're being unrealistic. You can't maintain that place. It's 5 hours away. The roof is going to need work in the next 2 years, and the septic system been inspected since '95. If we don't sell it now, we're going to lose this buyer, and then we're stuck with a property that's just draining your savings." "It isn't draining my savings, Mitchell." I pay the taxes, and the insurance is paid for the year. And what happens when you need care, Mom? His voice sharpened, the diplomatic veneer beginning to crack. What happens when you can't live in that house anymore? Teresa and I can't afford to pay for an assisted living facility out of our own pockets. We have families of our own to think about. That cabin is your biggest asset. It's what's going to pay for your future. We're trying to protect you. Protect me. They used the word like a shield, but it was really a weapon. They wanted to protect their own inheritance from the cost of my survival. They were terrified that my old age would be expensive, that my body would consume the equity they had already earmarked for their own lives. If I need care, Mitchell, I said, I will manage it. With what? He scoffed, his patience finally giving way. Your library pension? You have no idea what these places cost, Mom. You're living in a fantasy world. Now, where is the deed? If it's in the cedar chest, I'm coming over with a crowbar on Wednesday to get it out. We don't have time for these games. A year ago, a month ago, even a week ago, his anger would have made my stomach twist into a hard knot. I would have started to apologize, to rationalize, to find some way to appease his frustration. But today I felt nothing but a cool, spacious distance. The deed is not in the house, Mitchell, I said. And if you bring a crowbar into my home, I will call the police. The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear his breathing, short, heavy, and stunned. He had never, in his 44 years of life, heard his mother use the word police in reference to him. He didn't know what to do with the boundaries I was suddenly drawing in the sand. You're losing your mind, he whispered, his voice trembling with a cold, ugly anger. You're completely losing it. I'm calling Teresa. We're coming over on Sunday, and we're going to get this sorted out, whether you like it or not. I'll be here, I said quietly. I hung up the receiver before he could reply. I stood in the hall for a long moment, my hand resting on the black plastic of the telephone. The house was very quiet. Outside, the wind rustled the bare branches of the maple tree, making them scratch against the window pane like fingernails. They were coming on Sunday. They were coming with their anger, their resentment, and their absolute conviction that they had the right to dismantle my life for my own good. But Sunday was 3 days after Thursday. By the time they arrived at my kitchen table, the doors would already be locked, the keys would be in Roy Vance's office, and the ground beneath their feet would have already shifted. They just didn't know it yet. On Tuesday afternoon, I washed the good china. I didn't do it because I was expecting company, or because I wanted to keep busy. I did it because the delicate porcelain, with its hand-painted gold rim, had been sitting in the dark oak cabinet for 2 years, gathering a thin, sticky film of kitchen grease and neglect. Calvin and I had received the set as a wedding gift from his aunt in 1971. For decades, I had only brought it out for Thanksgiving and Christmas, terrified that Mitchell would chip a saucer, or Teresa would drop a cup. Now, as I stood at the sink, the warm, soapy water sliding over the smooth surface of the plates, I realized how foolish that caution had been. We spend our lives preserving things for a future that our children have already decided to discard. After I dried each piece with a clean linen towel, I went back to the kitchen counter. I pulled the small, folded yellow sticky note out of my cardigan pocket. The one Mitchell had left behind with his hurried handwriting. Oak Grove Cost. I didn't throw it away. I didn't hide it in a drawer. Instead, I took a small piece of tape and stuck it to the refrigerator door, right at eye level, next to the magnetic calendar showing the dates of my doctor appointments. I wanted it there, visible and clear, like a small yellow lighthouse warning me of the rocks ahead. I wanted to see it every time I made my morning tea. Thursday morning arrived, cold and overcast, the sky the color of dirty slush. I wore my navy blue wool suit again. As I drove the Les Sabres through the quiet streets of the town square, I felt a strange, cool detachment. The town where I had spent my entire adult life, the library where I had worked, the grocery store where I had chatted with neighbors, the streets where my children had ridden their bicycles, felt different today. It felt like a stage set after the play had finished. The buildings were still there, but the drama had ended. Roy Vance was waiting for me. His office was warm. The radiator under the window, hissing and clanking like a small steam engine. On his desk sat 3 thick documents bound in heavy blue paper. "Sylvia," Roy said, pulling out the leather chair for me. His voice was quiet, respectful, and entirely free of the hurried transactional tone my children used. "I have drafted the trust agreement and the deeds. I want to go over the key points with you one last time before we sign, just to ensure you are completely comfortable with the terms." "I am comfortable, Roy," I said, setting my purse on my lap. "But please, go ahead." Roy sat down, putting on a pair of wire-rimmed reading glasses. He ran his finger down the first page of the blue document. "This is the Sylvia Miller Irrevocable Living Trust," he said. "Once you sign this, the title to your home in town and the cabin at Lost Land Lake will be officially transferred to the trust. You are the lifetime beneficiary. My firm, Vance and Associates, is the designated co-trustee. This means that while you are alive, you have the absolute, unchallengeable right to live in your home and use the cabin. Your children cannot sell them. They cannot mortgage them, and they cannot use them as collateral for any debts." He paused, looking over his glasses to ensure I was following. I nodded. "Furthermore," Roy continued, "as the co-trustee, my firm is legally obligated to protect these assets. If Mitchell or Teresa attempt to initiate any legal proceedings, to declare you incompetent, or to take control of your affairs, the trust is structured to defend itself. They will be fighting my firm, not you. And the cost of that defense will be borne by the trust's maintenance fund, which we have funded with the $40,000 from your savings." "And if they try to put me in a care facility?" I asked. "They cannot use the equity of your home or the cabin to pay for it," Roy said firmly. "And without that equity, most private facilities will not accept a placement without a personal financial guarantee from the children themselves. If they want to put you in a home, Sylvia, they will have to pay for it out of their own pockets. I suspect that will make them very eager to keep you living independently in your own house." A small, quiet smile touched my lips. It was a masterpiece of legal architecture. Roy had built a fortress around my remaining years, using my children's own greed as the mortar. "Let's sign, Roy," I said. He handed me a heavy black fountain pen. The metal was cold against my fingers. I signed my name on the designated lines, Sylvia Joanne Miller. I wrote it 3 times. Once for the trust agreement, once for the house deed, and once for the cabin deed. My handwriting didn't shake. The blue ink flowed smoothly over the thick, textured paper, leaving a permanent record of my survival. When I was finished, Roy took a heavy steel notary stamp from his drawer. He placed it over my signature and brought his palm down with a loud metallic thud clack. The sound was sharp, heavy, and final. It sounded like a gavel falling in a courtroom. It sounded like a door locking from the inside. "It's done, Sylvia," he said, taking off his glasses and offering me a warm, steady hand. "The deeds will be recorded with the county by tomorrow afternoon. You are safe." "Thank you, Roy," I said. "You have no idea what this means to me." "I think I do," he said softly. I drove home slowly. On the way, I stopped at the grocery store, not because it was Tuesday, but because it was Thursday, and I wanted to buy a small ribeye steak, some fresh rosemary, and a bottle of red wine. I hadn't bought wine since Calvin died. My children had told me it was unnecessary sugar for someone with my cholesterol. Today, I didn't care about my cholesterol. I cared about the taste of oak and cherries on my tongue. That evening, the house felt different. The draft that always came from the hallway door didn't feel cold anymore. It felt clean. The ticking of the grandfather clock didn't sound like a countdown. It sounded like a drumbeat, steady and strong. Friday and Saturday passed in a quiet, luxurious blur. I ate my steak. I drank my wine. I read a book from the library, a novel about a woman who traveled to Italy alone, a book Mitchell would have deemed wasteful nonsense. Then Sunday morning arrived. At precisely 1 o'clock, the quiet of the afternoon was shattered by the sound of tires on the gravel driveway. Not 1 car, but 2. I stood by the kitchen window, holding my warm teacup, and watched them pull in. Mitchell's heavy silver pickup truck parked first, followed closely by Teresa's massive white SUV. They got out of their vehicles almost simultaneously, their movements hurried, their faces set in the grim, determined expressions of soldiers preparing to take a hill. They didn't look at the sky or the bare maple tree. They walked straight toward my front door. Mitchell carrying a leather briefcase, Teresa clutching her purse like a shield. I took a slow breath, set my teacup on the counter next to the yellow sticky note, and walked down the hall to meet them. The front door didn't slam this time. Mitchell turned his key in the lock, but I had already turned the deadbolt back. I opened the door before he could pull his key out, catching him off guard. He stood on the porch, his hand suspended in the cold air, his face tightening when he saw me standing there in my navy wool suit. "Mom," he said, recovering quickly. He didn't smile. He stepped past me into the hall, bringing the scent of damp wool and winter exhaust with him. Teresa's right behind me. Teresa was already on the porch, her head ducked against the wind, her oversized designer purse tucked under her arm like a football. She didn't look at me as she came inside. She went straight to the hall closet, hung her coat on a wire hanger with a loud, metallic clatter, and marched into the kitchen. "It's freezing in here, Mom," she called out, her voice echoing in the quiet house. "Did you turn the thermostat down again to save money? We've told you, you can't do that. You're going to freeze the pipes." "The heat is at 68, Teresa," I said, walking slowly into the dining room. "It is perfectly comfortable." Mitchell was already at the dining room table. He had placed his heavy leather briefcase directly in the center of the oak wood, right over the spot where Calvin's ledger books had sat 2 days ago. He popped the brass latches on the two sharp metallic snaps that sounded like pistol shots in the quiet room. "Sit down, Mom," Mitchell said. He didn't ask. It was the directive, the kind he used when he was about to lay off a warehouse supervisor. "We have a lot to go over, and I have a flight to Atlanta at 7 tonight." I didn't sit in my usual chair at the foot of the table. I walked to the head of the table, Calvin's chair, and sat down. Mitchell and Teresa both froze for a fraction of a second. They looked at each other, a quick, silent exchange of confusion, before Mitchell sat opposite me. Teresa sat to his left, her hands clasped on her purse in her lap, her face fixed in an expression of pained maternal patience. "Mom," Mitchell began, leaning forward, his voice carrying that heavy, practiced weight of family authority. "We're here because we love you. But things have reached a point where we can't just stand by and do nothing. Monday's phone call, you threatening to call the police on me? That's not like you. It's a sign that the stress of living alone in this house is getting to be too much for you to handle." "Is it?" I asked, my hands folded loosely on the table. "Yes, it is," Teresa chimed in, her voice dripping with a synthetic, honeyed concern. "We've been talking to Dr. Mercer's office, and we really think we need to get a full cognitive assessment scheduled, just to see where we are. And in the meantime, Mitchell has drawn up some papers to make things easier for you." Mitchell reached into his briefcase and pulled out a neat stack of white documents, bound by a silver paperclip. He slid them across the table toward me. "These are standard durable power of attorney forms," Mitchell said, his pen clicking once, twice, 3 times. "They give me the authority to handle your financial decisions. And they give Teresa the authority to manage your medical care. It's what's best, Mom. It means you won't have to worry about the bills or the property taxes or the maintenance on this place anymore. We'll handle everything." I looked down at the white pages. The text was dense, filled with legal jargon about the principal and the attorney-in-fact. "And the cabin?" I asked quietly. "We've already signed the listing agreement with the agent," Mitchell said, his voice firm, brook no argument. "She's coming out on Tuesday to take the photos. We're listing it at $295,000. Once it sells, the money will go into a restricted account to pay for your future care. We've actually already looked at a beautiful suite at the Oak Ridge facility, the one near my office. It has a lovely garden view, Mom. You'll have people to talk to, and you won't be so isolated." They sat back, waiting. They believed the trap was complete. They believed that by presenting me with a unified front, by using terms like cognitive assessment and restricted account, they could frighten me into signing away the remaining years of my life. I stood up from the table. Teresa's eyes followed me, her posture stiffening. "Where are you going, Mom? We're trying to have a serious conversation." I didn't answer. I walked into the kitchen, my slippers silent on the linoleum. I went to the refrigerator, peeled the yellow sticky note off the door, and walked back into the dining room. I placed the yellow note directly on top of the power of attorney forms. Mitchell had slid toward me. Mitchell looked down at it. His eyes scanned the words, Oak Grove cost. For a second, the room was so quiet I could hear the wind rattling the storm windows in the living room. Mitchell's face went a strange pale gray color under his office tan. His thumb stopped clicking his pen. "What is this?" Teresa asked, leaning over to look. Her face instantly dropped its mask of synthetic concern, her mouth twitching with a sudden, sharp discomfort. "I found it on the table last Sunday," I said, my voice very quiet, very calm. "You left it behind, Mitchell. While you were discussing my funeral like a scheduling inconvenience. While you were deciding that my body was too thin-skinned to be presentable, and that my friends were too dead to make a viewing necessary." "Mom," Mitchell stammered, his voice cracking slightly. He reached out to touch the paper, then pulled his hand back as if it were hot. "We were just being practical. You have to plan for these things. It didn't mean we wanted. It wasn't personal." "Everything is personal, Mitchell," I said, sitting back down in Calvin's chair. "Especially when you are counting your mother's remaining breaths to see if they will interfere with your vacation schedule." "This is ridiculous," Teresa snapped, her anger finally breaking through the veneer of politeness. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. "We are your children, Mom. We have spent the last 5 years taking care of you, bringing you groceries, managing your doctor visits. And you're going to sit there and treat us like criminals. Because we had a practical conversation about the future. It's ungrateful. It's completely ungrateful." "I am not ungrateful, Teresa," I said, looking up at her. "I am simply informed. And because I am informed, I decided to take your advice." Mitchell frowned, his eyes darting between me and the yellow note. "What advice?" "I decided to be practical," I said. "I spent my Thursday afternoon with Roy Vance." Mitchell froze. His pen slid out of his fingers, rolling across the polished oak table until it hit the edge of his briefcase with a soft plastic click. "What did you do, Mom?" he whispered. "What did you sign?" "An irrevocable living trust," I said, my voice steady, my eyes resting on Mitchell's pale, frozen face. "The title to this house and the cabin at Lost Land Lake have been transferred to the trust. Vance and Associates is the designated co-trustee." Mitchell sat perfectly still for 3 long seconds. His mind, always so quick to calculate logistics and shipping lanes, was running the legal formulas, trying to find the loophole, the escape hatch, the small print. I could see the exact moment he realized there wasn't one. His jaw tightened, the skin around his mouth turning white. "An irrevocable trust," he said, his voice rising, losing its measured professional tone. "Are you out of your mind, Mom? Do you have any idea what you've done? You've given away your assets. You've locked up your money. If you need to sell this house to pay for a medical emergency, you can't do it now without Roy Vance's signature." "I know exactly what I've done, Mitchell," I said quietly. "I have ensured that I will live in my home for the rest of my days. And if you or Teresa want to put me in a care facility, you will have to pay for it yourselves. The equity of this house is no longer available to you," Teresa gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked at Mitchell, her eyes with a sudden sharp panic. "Mitchell, what does this mean? What does this mean for the cabin? The listing agent, she's coming on Tuesday." "There is no listing," I said, looking at her. You can call your friend from the Chamber of Commerce and cancel the appointment, Mitchell. You do not own the cabin. If it is ever sold, the proceeds do not go to you or Teresa. They go to the Children's Literacy Fund at the county library. The library? Teresa shrieked, the word escaping her mouth in a high, raw burst of disbelief. She took a step toward the head of the table, her face contorting with a mixture of rage and betrayal. You gave our inheritance to the library after everything we've done for you. All those weekends I spent driving over here to clean your kitchen. All the groceries I bought you. All the time I took away from my own daughter to make sure you were taken care of. You're leaving our money to strangers? I looked at her, really looked at her. This was the core of it, stripped of all the polite clinical concern about my health, my blood pressure, and my cognitive decline. The weekends she spent here weren't gifts of love. They were installments on a debt she expected me to pay with my death. The low-sodium soups and the grocery trips were just maintenance fees on an asset she was trying to keep viable until the liquidation date. It is not your money, Teresa, I said softly. It was your father's, and it is mine. You did not carry the logs to build that cabin. You did not work 34 years behind a desk to pay off the mortgage on this house. You have not spent a single day of your life wondering how you would pay the heating bill. You only came here to count the hours until the estate was settled. This isn't legal, Mitchell said, his voice dropping to a low, shaking hiss. He stood up, leaning over his briefcase. His fingers dug so hard into the leather that his knuckles were white. You're 71, Mom. You're clearly not in your right mind. You've been manipulated by Roy Vance. We can contest this in court. We'll get a lawyer of our own. We'll file for guardianship. You can try, Mitchell, I said, looking up at him. But Roy is prepared for that. The trust is funded to defend itself. We took $40,000 from my savings to establish a legal defense fund. If you file a motion, Roy's firm will respond. And the cost of his hourly rate will be paid directly out of the trust's maintenance account. Your inheritance will shrink with every document your lawyer files. I wonder how much of your own money you are willing to spend to fight a law firm that has been in this town since 1950. Mitchell stared at me. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He was a man who understood numbers. He understood that a legal battle against an established firm, funded by my own savings, was a losing proposition. Even if they won, after years of litigation, there would be nothing left but dust and court fees. The silence that fell over the room was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. Teresa slowly sat back down in her chair, her shoulders slumping. Her face was pale, her eyes fixed on the polished oak table. She looked smaller now, stripped of the frantic, self-important energy she always carried. She looked like a child who had just been told that the game was over, and she had lost. "Why?" she whispered, her voice cracking, a genuine raw tear finally slipping down her cheek. "Why would you do this to us, Mom? We're your children. We love you." A child's love, Teresa, does not require a mother's disappearance to prove itself, I said. You stopped seeing me 2 years ago when Calvin died. You only saw a problem to be solved, a house to be emptied, a life to be scheduled. I spent 30 years holding this family together, smoothing over every crack, sacrificing every draft of my own life so you two could run ahead. But I will not spend my remaining years being treated like a ghost in my own kitchen. Mitchell slowly closed his briefcase. The two brass latches snapped shut, with a dull, hollow click that sounded entirely different from the sharp snaps of 20 minutes ago. They sounded like the end of something. "We're leaving," Mitchell said, his voice flat, dead, and empty of all emotion. He didn't look at me. He picked up his briefcase and walked toward the hallway. Teresa stood up. She clutched her designer purse to her chest, her face tight, her eyes red. She looked at me once, a long, hard look filled with a bitter, freezing resentment that I knew would never melt. "Don't call us, Mom," she said, her voice shaking. "Since you have Roy Vance to handle your life, you can call him when you need your driveway shoveled this winter. You can call the library when you're lonely." She turned and followed Mitchell down the hall. A moment later, the front door closed. It didn't slam. It clicked shut with a quiet, solid finality that echoed through the empty house. I sat at the head of the table in Calvin's chair. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving the afternoon quiet and gray. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall was the only sound, steady, rhythmic, and peaceful. I looked at the yellow sticky note sitting on the white power of attorney forms Mitchell had left behind. I picked it up, folded it into a small square, and walked into the kitchen. I dropped it into the wastebasket under the sink, then went to the counter and picked up my teacup. The tea was cold, but I drank it anyway. It tasted like freedom. On Monday morning, the clock on the hallway wall ticked past 9:15. The telephone on the small wooden desk remained silent. Usually, the lack of that 9:15 call would have sent a cold shiver of anxiety through my stomach. I would have spent the morning pacing the floorboards, wondering if Teresa was angry with me, if one of the grandchildren was sick, or if I had somehow failed to meet some unwritten expectation of my family. I would have eventually swallowed my pride and called her, offering some small, placating apology just to hear the familiar, hurried click of her tongue. That meant I was tolerated once more. Today I didn't pace. I made a fresh pot of coffee, poured a splash of heavy cream into my favorite gold-rimmed cup, and sat on the back porch with a thick wool blanket draped over my knees. The morning was crisp, the sky a pale, hard blue that promised a clear day. I watched the silver frost on the grass slowly dissolve under the touch of the pale sun, turning into tiny, sparkling beads of water. The silence of the neighborhood wasn't a wait anymore. It was a wide open space. It was a clean sheet of paper waiting for me to write on it. Wednesday and Friday passed in the same quiet, uninterrupted rhythm. No phone calls, no text messages, no silver pickup truck idling in my driveway. My children were testing me again. They believed that by withdrawing their presence, by leaving me to face the winter alone, they would force me to realize how desperately I needed them. They expected the cold to get to me. They expected the heavy snow when it came, to make me regret the day I locked them out of my legal affairs. They were waiting for me to break. But they didn't understand that when you have lived inside a marriage for 40 years and inside a family for 50, you learn how to keep yourself warm. You learn how to build a fire out of your own memories when the people around you have gone cold. On Friday afternoon, I pulled my black plastic checkbook out of my vanity drawer. I looked at the balance. $39,412. I was 71. If I lived another 10 years, this money, combined with my modest library pension and Calvin's Social Security, was more than enough for my personal needs. I had spent 50 years saving every penny, buying discount canned goods, mending old coats, and denying myself any luxury, believing that my sacrifice was the foundation of my children's future. I had been wrong. My sacrifice had only made them soft, entitled, and eager for my end. I decided I was going to the cabin. I hadn't been to Lost Land Lake in 2 summers. After Calvin died, Mitchell and Teresa had forbidden me from driving up there. They had told me the 5-hour drive was too strenuous for someone my age. They had told me the gravel roads were too rough, that my reflexes were too slow to handle the deer that leaped out from the birch woods at dusk, and that the isolation of the lake was dangerous for a widow with a mild heart murmur. They had dismantled my confidence, nut by bolt, until I believed them. I had spent 2 years sitting in my sunroom, looking at the maple tree, believing I was too fragile to cross the state line alone, but standing in my quiet kitchen on Friday afternoon, I realized the fragility wasn't mine. It was theirs. They were afraid of my capability, because capability is hard to manage. An old woman who can drive 5 hours to her own cabin is an old woman who does not need to be filed away in a facility with a garden view. I took my Buick LeSabre to Gordon's auto service on the south side of town. Gordon was 68, a quiet man with grease-stained knuckles and a slow, thoughtful way of speaking. He had been servicing Calvin's trucks since the 70s. He wiped his hands on a red shop rag as I pulled into the bay. "Sylvia," he said, nodding respectfully. "Haven't seen this car in a while. Mitchell usually brings it in for the oil changes." "Mitchell is busy, Gordon," I said, stepping out of the car. The smell of gasoline, rubber, and motor oil in the garage felt clean, honest, and familiar. "I'm taking her up to Lost Land Lake tomorrow morning. I want to make sure the tires are good and the fluids are fresh." Gordon looked at me, his eyebrows rising slightly, but he didn't argue. He didn't use the loud, condescending tone my son used. He simply patted the silver hood of the LeSabre. "Up to the lake? That's a long stretch for one person, Sylvia," he said quietly. "But this Buick, they don't build them like this anymore. It's got the 3.8 V6. It'll run forever if you treat it right. I'll check the belts, the hoses, and the brakes myself. Make sure you're safe." "Thank you, Gordon," I said. "I appreciate it." While he worked, I walked down to the small hardware store on the corner. I bought a new flashlight, a pair of heavy work gloves, and a small brass padlock for the cabin's woodshed. I paid with my own credit card, the one Mitchell had tried to convince me to cancel, because it's too easy for hackers to get your numbers, Mom. When I returned to the garage, Gordon had the Buick washed and waiting for me. "She's ready, Sylvia," he said, handing me the keys. "Everything's tight. Oil's fresh, brakes are solid. You've got a full tank of gas. You just take your time on those state roads near the border. Watch out for the frost heaves." "I will, Gordon," I said, pressing a $20 bill into his hand alongside the cost of the service. He tried to refuse it, but I insisted. "For your time." That night I packed a single suitcase. I didn't pack the navy blue wool suit. I packed my heavy denim trousers, 3 flannel shirts that had belonged to Calvin, the ones that still smelled faintly of cedar and wood smoke, and my old hiking boots with the red laces. At 9 o'clock, the phone rang once. I picked it up, my heart steady. "Sylvia?" It was Roy Vance. "I just wanted to call and let you know that the county deeds have been officially recorded. The trust is fully finalized. You are completely secure." "Thank you, Roy," I said, looking at the suitcase sitting on my bedroom floor. "I'm actually leaving for the cabin tomorrow morning." There was a brief pause on the line, and then I heard Roy chuckle, a quiet, warm sound of genuine satisfaction. "It's beautiful up there this time of year, Sylvia. The birches should be completely bare now. You'll have a clear view of the water. Be safe." "I will, Roy," I said. On Saturday morning, the sun hadn't yet broken through the gray mist when I carried my suitcase out to the car. The air was biting, smelling of damp earth and impending winter. I put the suitcase in the trunk, locked the house door, and got behind the wheel of the Lesab. The engine started with a smooth, powerful purr. I backed down the driveway, my eyes on the rearview mirror. The street was quiet, the houses dark, my neighbors still sleeping. The hardest part of leaving a cage isn't unlocking the door. It's convincing yourself that the sky still belongs to you. I turned the Buick toward the highway, and as the town square disappeared behind me in the gray morning light, I felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the last 2 years slip off my shoulders and vanish into the draft. The highway was a long, gray ribbon that unrolled before the silver hood of the Lesab. As I drove north, the concrete suburbs of the city gradually gave way to the rolling, yellowed hills of the southern Wisconsin dairy country. The barns were red and weathered, their silos standing like stone sentinels against the gray sky. By the 3rd hour, the oaks and maples faded, replaced by the dark, dense corridors of white pine, balsam, and paper birch that marked the beginning of the northern woods. The air coming through the Buick's vents changed. It lost the heavy chemical scent of suburban exhaust and took on the sharp, clean bite of wet pine needles and cold earth. I kept the radio off. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic hum of the tires on the asphalt and the low, reassuring purr of the V6 engine. It was a sound that felt like a heartbeat. I looked at the empty passenger seat beside me. For 40 years, that seat had been occupied by Calvin. He would sit with his left arm resting on the door frame, his hand holding a thermos of black coffee, his eyes scanning the tree line for deer. He was a man who didn't feel the need to fill the silence with useless words. We could drive for 3 hours without speaking, yet we were never lonely. Behind us, in the back seat, Mitchell and Teresa would fight over a comic book or a bag of potato chips, their young voices high, sharp, and demanding. I would spend the drive twisting around in my seat, passing back apple slices, wiping sticky fingers, and smoothing over the small, endless conflicts of their childhood. I had been the shock absorber of the family. I had spent my youth ensuring that the friction of their lives never reached Calvin, and that Calvin's occasional silent moods never bruised their fragile spirits. Now there was no one to pacify. There was no one to soothe. The back seat was empty, my suitcase sitting quietly in the trunk. I turned off the state highway onto Lake Road 12, the narrow gravel road that wound through the birch forest to the shore of Lost Land Lake. The gravel crunched under the tires, a dry, satisfying sound that brought back a rush of 40 summers. The birch trees lined the road like white bones against the gray afternoon, their yellow leaves gone, their bare branches reaching up to the sky. The cabin appeared through the trees. It sat on a slight rise overlooking the water, a low, solid building clad in dark pine logs, with a green metal roof that Calvin and I had installed ourselves in the summer of '92. It looked smaller than I remembered, but sturdy, rooted to the granite ledge beneath it, like a lichen-covered boulder. I parked the Buick in the grass. I got out of the car, and the silence of the North Woods immediately wrapped around me. It was a silence that was different from the silence of my house in town. It wasn't empty. It was full of the soft rustle of the pines, the distant, lonely cry of a crow, and the gentle, rhythmic lapping of the water against the stony shore. I walked down to the water's edge. The lake was a sheet of cold, slate-gray glass, reflecting the bare branches of the trees and the heavy purple clouds that hung low on the horizon. The dock had been pulled up onto the grass for the winter, resting on its side like a skeleton. Our old neighbor, Wesley, a retired forest ranger who lived a mile down the road, had handled it for me, just as he had done every autumn since Calvin died. I walked up the porch steps. The key felt heavy in my hand as I fitted it into the brass padlock on the heavy wooden door. The lock turned with a dry, stiff click. I pushed the door open, stepping inside. The air inside the cabin was cold, dry, and smelling of cedar wool blankets, and the faint, sweet scent of wood smoke from the last Calvin had built here 2 years ago. Nothing had changed. His old plaid wool jacket still hung from the peg behind the door, his green rubber boots sitting beneath it, dusted with a fine layer of gray pollen. On the mantelpiece sat a jar of dried pine cones, a wooden loon he had carved during a rainy week in August, and a small framed photograph of the two of us standing on the dock, our faces sunburned and smiling. We had been so happy here. We had been free from the mortgages, the utility bills, and the endless, polite social obligations of our life in town. Here we were just two people who worked the wood and watched the lake. I went to the heavy cast iron Jotul stove in the corner of the living room. I knelt on the hearth, my knees making that dry popping sound, and opened the door. Inside were several dry birch logs, placed there by Wesley before the first frost. I laid some dry birch bark under the logs, took a box of matches from the mantelpiece, and struck one. The sudden bright flare of yellow light illuminated the dark stove. I held the flame to the bark, watching it catch, the curl of paper turning black before erupting into a bright, hot orange flame. I closed the stove door, leaving it cracked just an inch to let the draft in. Within minutes, the stove began to make a low, roaring sound, the sound of the draft carrying the heat up the chimney. I stood up, resting my hand on the cold iron of the mantelpiece, watching the thin thread of wood smoke rise through the bare branches of the pines outside. Some people believe that a woman alone is a tragedy, a piece of driftwood waiting to be carried away by the current. They assume that without a husband to protect her, or children to manage her, she has no center, no strength of her own. They do not understand that the current has no power over a stone. I went to the small pine table by the window. I pulled my phone out of my purse. There was no service up here, just the small gray words, no service blinking in the corner of the screen. I didn't try to find a signal. I turned the phone off, placed it face down on the wood, and went to make myself a hot cup of tea. The sun was setting now, casting a dark, bruised purple hue over the quiet water of Lost Land Lake. The cabin was growing warm, the heat of the wood stove beginning to seep into the log walls, pushing the cold back into the corners. I sat in Calvin's old rocking chair by the window, my hands wrapped around my mug, and watched the darkness fall over the lake. For the first time in 2 years, I was exactly where I wanted to be. I woke on Sunday morning to the smell of cold cedar and the pale gray light of the north woods filtering through the pine-framed window. The bedroom was freezing, the air so cold that my breath rose in tiny white plumes before disappearing toward the rafters, but beneath 3 layers of heavy wool quilts, ones I had hand-pieced from Calvin's old winter shirts 20 years ago. I was perfectly warm. I lay still for a long time, listening to the absolute stillness of the lake. There were no sirens, no leaf blowers, no rumble of morning traffic on the bypass. There was only the quiet, hollow creak of the cabin walls expanding in the morning sun. I got out of bed, wrapped my wool robe around my shoulders, and walked into the living room. The Jotul stove had burned down to a pile of thick, red embers that glowed in the dark cast iron belly. I opened the door, stirred the coals with a heavy brass poker until they sparked, and laid 3 fresh split birch logs on top. They caught most immediately, the sweet, dry scent of birch wood smoke filling the room. I set the blue enamel percolator on the small gas burner in the kitchen. As the coffee began to bubble and hiss, its dark, rich aroma cutting through the cold of the cabin, I stood by the window and looked out at the lake. A light fog was rising from the water, drifting through the dark pines like shreds of gray silk. At 9:30, the low, deep rumble of a truck engine broke the silence. I looked out and saw a faded forest green Ford F-150 pulling slowly into the gravel drive. It was Wesley's truck. He was 72, a retired Wisconsin forest ranger who had lived on the lake since the late 70s. He was a man of the woods, wide-shouldered, quiet, and possessing that dry, weather-beaten face that comes from 40 years of winter patrols. He got out of the truck, carrying a small bundle of dry cedar kindling wrapped in a piece of burlap. He walked up the porch steps, his heavy boots making a slow, steady thump on the pine planks. I opened the door before he could knock. "Sylvia," he said, nodding his head in a brief, respectful gesture. He didn't smile, but his eyes were warm. "Saw the smoke from the chimney. Figured you had made it up." "I did, Wesley," I said, stepping back to let him in. "Come on in. The coffee's just finished." He stepped into the kitchen, placing the bundle of kindling by the wood stove. He took off his heavy wool cap, exposing a crop of thick silver hair, and sat at the pine table. I poured him a mug of coffee, black, just the way Calvin used to drink it, and sat opposite him. "Thank you for pulling the dock up, Wesley," I said, "and for leaving the wood in the stove. It made things much easier last night." He took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes resting on the photograph of Calvin and me on the mantelpiece before turning to me. Calvin would have done the same for me, Sylvia. It's what neighbors do. You don't leave a place untended for the winter. We sat in silence for a few moments, the comfort of it easy and familiar. In the North Woods, silence isn't an awkward gap to be filled. It's a form of politeness. Your boy Mitchell called me, Wesley said quietly, setting his mug down on the wood. Late on Friday night, around 10 o'clock. I felt a small, familiar tightness in my chest, but I kept my face calm. Did he? Yeah, Wesley nodded. He sounded wound up. Asked if I'd seen your Buick up here, or if you'd called me about having the water turned back on. He was asking if I thought you were acting confused lately. Wesley's voice carried a thin, hard edge of disapproval as he said the word confused. He was an old-school Northwoodsman. He had no patience for city panic or for children who spoke of their parents as if they were failing machinery. What did you tell him, Wesley? I asked. I told him that if you were confused, it was the first time in the 40 years I've known you, Wesley said, his voice flat and steady. I told him you were 71, not 71 days old. I told him you knew how to run a stove and how to drive a car, and that if you were up here, it was because you wanted to be. He didn't like that. No, I murmured. I don't imagine he did. He was talking about listing the place, Wesley continued, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked out at the lake. Said there was a buyer from Chicago interested. I told him Calvin's cabin isn't for sale as long as you're breathing, Sylvia. I told him that if any real estate agents showed up on this gravel road, I'd block drive with my tractor and tell them they were trespassing. A deep, quiet wave of gratitude washed over me. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his weathered sleeve. Thank you, Wesley. You don't have to thank me, he said, his voice dropping to a lower, rougher register. Mitchell's a city boy now, Sylvia. He looks at this lake and he just sees dollar signs on a spreadsheet. He doesn't understand that some things are paid for in sweat and years, and you don't sell them just because the market is high. He's looking for leverage, though. He's mad because you took the wheel back. Let him be mad, I said softly. He asked if I'd let him know if you showed up, Wesley said, looking me in the eye. I told him my phone line has been acting up lately, and I might not get his messages. A small, genuine smile broke across my face. Your phone line has always been unreliable, Wesley. That's true, he said, a faint glimmer of amusement in his gray eyes. Especially when I don't want to talk to people. He finished his coffee, stood up, and pulled his wool cap back over his ears. I'm going to go split some of that birch behind your shed. Make sure you have enough to last the week if the snow starts early. You just stay inside where it's warm, Sylvia. I will, Wesley, I said. I watched him walk down the porch steps and head toward the woodshed, his heavy axe resting over his shoulder. A moment later, the steady, rhythmic thud crack of his axe splitting the birch logs echoed through the quiet woods. I sat at the table, holding my warm mug. Mitchell had called Wesley. He was panicking. He was trying to build a case, trying to find some evidence that I was incompetent, that I was a danger to myself up here in the woods. He wanted to use my age as a license for his own ambitions. But he was 5 hours away, trapped in his office with his spreadsheets and his dual monitors. And up here, on the shore of Lost Land Lake, the trees were thick, The water was cold, and the neighbors still remembered what loyalty felt like. On Monday morning, the lake was a sheet of cold blue steel under a sky that had cleared to a brilliant, freezing clarity. I took the Buick into Hayward. The 5-mile stretch of gravel road was empty, the birch trees throwing long, blue shadows across the road as the morning sun filtered through the woods. The town of Hayward was quiet in the off-season. The summer tourists, with their speedboats and their loud sunburned children, had long since departed for Chicago and Minneapolis. The bait shops and fudge parlors along the main street were closed, their windows dark, leaving the town to the loggers, the locals, and the quiet, steady rhythm of the northern winter. I parked the Le Sabre near the small grocery store on the edge of town. Inside, the air smelled of floor wax and fresh-baked bread. I bought a small carton of milk, a dozen brown eggs, a jar of local clover honey, and a box of saltines. The cashier, a middle-aged woman with a kind, tired face and a thick wool cardigan, nodded to me as she slid my items across the scanner. "Up for the winter, Sylvia?" she asked, recognizing me from my decades of summer visits. "Just for a little while, Marie," I said, offering her a warm, quiet smile. "I wanted to see the lake before it freezes over." "It's the best time," she murmured, wrapping my milk in a brown paper bag. "No noise, no jet skis, just the woods. You keep yourself warm out there." "I will," I said. I carried my small bag of groceries out to the car. Before I started the engine, I sat in the driver's seat, the sun shining through the windshield and warming my hands. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. I turned it on. The small silver screen lit up, and almost immediately, the phone began to vibrate in my palm. A series of sharp digital buzzes that felt cold and frantic in the quiet of the car. There were 3 missed calls and 4 text messages. I leaned my head back against the headrest, took a slow breath, and opened the messages. The first was from Mitchell, sent on Friday night, shortly after he had hung up on Wesley. "You've made your choice, Mom," it read. "I've canceled the listing agent. We won't be checking on the house in town anymore. If the pipes freeze or the roof leaks this winter, you're on your own. We have our own lives to manage, and since you've decided to treat us like the enemy, we're stepping back permanently." The second was from Teresa, sent on Saturday morning. Her message carried a different, sharper kind of venom, the kind that comes from a greed that has been dressed up as a grievance. "I hope you're happy," she wrote. "Avery's college housing deposit was due yesterday, and because we couldn't access the cabin fund like we planned, Mitchell had to take out a high-interest personal loan to cover it. You are hurting your own granddaughter to prove some point. I hope the Library Literacy Fund enjoys our family's future." The third was also from Teresa, sent yesterday afternoon. "We're letting the rest of the family know that you've decided to cut us out of your life. Thanksgiving is at my house this year, but obviously, since you want your independence, we'll leave you to your peace. Don't worry about sending gifts for the kids. They know what you did." I sat in the quiet parking lot, the phone resting in my lap. I looked out at the main street of Hayward, at the pickup trucks parked in front of the hardware store, at a dog trotting happily along the sidewalk. My children had shifted their strategy. They had realized that the legal walls Roy Vance had built were too high to climb, and that my savings were too well protected for them to steal. So now they were trying the ultimate weapon, exile. They were cutting me out of Thanksgiving. They were telling my grandchildren that I was the villain, the selfish old woman who had stolen their college deposits to fund a library. They believed the cold, heavy weight of a holiday alone would break my resolve. They believed the silence of my family's absence would frighten me into calling them, begging for forgiveness, and offering to tear up the trust documents just to be allowed back to their table. A year ago, those messages would have devastated me. I would have spent the afternoon weeping in my kitchen, my hands shaking as I dialed Teresa's number, ready to give them the cabin, the house, and every penny of my savings just to keep from being discarded. But today the pain was clean. It was like the cold northern air, sharp, but it woke you up. It cleared the dust from your lungs. My grandchildren didn't need the cabin fund to pay for their housing. Avery's father was a regional manager for a logistics firm. Her mother drove a $60,000 SUV and spent her summers on cruises to Alaska. They had the money. They simply didn't want to spend their money when they could have spent mine. And Thanksgiving. I remembered the last 5 Thanksgivings. I had spent them in Teresa's kitchen, my knees aching as I basted her 30-pound turkey, washed her mountain of pots and pans, and listened to Mitchell and his brother-in-law argue about the stock market while they drank my Calvin's whiskey. They didn't see me at those dinners. They only saw a kitchen maid who didn't charge for her labor. The ultimate punishment a selfish child can devise is their own absence, believing their presence was the only thing keeping their mother's world spinning. They didn't understand that the world spins perfectly well without them. I turned the phone off. I slipped it back into my purse, started the Le Sabre, and drove out of the parking lot. As I drove back toward the lakes, the sky began to turn a heavy, leaden gray. The wind picked up, rustling the bare branches of the birches, and the first white flakes of the winter's snow began to dance across my windshield, tiny, fragile stars that melted the moment they hit the glass. By the time I reached the cabin, the snow was settling on the green metal roof, turning the dark logs to a pale silver white. I carried my small bag of groceries inside, placed the milk and eggs in the refrigerator, and went to stoke the wood stove. I sat by the window in Calvin's old rocking chair, my cup of honey-sweetened tea in my hand, and watched the snow fall over the slate-gray water of Lost Land Lake. The winter was coming. But for the first time in my life, I was ready for the cold. By the second week of November, the snow had settled into a thick, permanent blanket over the north woods. The temperature dropped, and the edges of Lost Land Lake began to freeze. I stood on the porch in the mornings, watching the dark, glassy ice creep slowly outward from the shore, silent and hard as iron. The lake was closing itself in for the winter, sealing its secrets beneath a roof of black ice. Inside the cabin, I had established a routine that felt deeply peaceful. I woke at dawn, tended the wood stove, and made my oatmeal with a spoonful of the local clover honey. I spent my mornings cleaning the small rooms, polishing the pine floors until they reflected the yellow flame of the oil lamps, and washing the windows until the glass disappeared. I read the books I had brought from Hayward, novels about distant places, histories of old wars, Things I had never had the time to read when I was managing a household of 4. For 71 years, my life had been defined by the needs of others. I had been a daughter, a wife, a mother, and a librarian, always standing behind a desk or a stove, waiting to answer a question or provide a meal. Now there was no one to ask. There was no one to feed. The silence of the cabin wasn't a vacuum. It was a sanctuary. One Thursday afternoon, the low mechanical whine of a snowmobile broke the quiet. I looked out and saw Wesley pulling into the drive, his red Polaris machine trailing a small cloud of white exhaust. He was wearing his heavy canvas ranger suit, a thick layer of frost clinging to his mustache. He got off the machine, carrying a small bundle of envelopes tied with a rubber band. "Mail delivery, Sylvia," he said as I opened the door, his voice muffled by his wool scarf. "Had to go into Hayward for some spark plugs, so I checked your post office box for you." "Come in, Wesley," I said. "I've got a pot of vegetable soup on the stove. It's hot." He stepped inside, stamping his boots on the rug, and placed the mail on the pine table. He sat by the wood stove, letting the heat thaw his hands, while I ladled a bowl of the thick, steaming soup for him. He ate in quiet, appreciative silence, nodding his head after the first spoonful. "You've got the touch, Sylvia," he murmured. "My soup always tastes like dishwater." "It's just salt, pepper, and thyme, Wesley," I said, sitting opposite him. After he finished, he wiped his mustache with his handkerchief, thanked me for the lunch, and went back out to his snowmobile. I watched him ride away through the white pines, his machine disappearing into the gray afternoon. I turned back to the mail on the table. There were several utility bills for the townhouse, which I paid immediately with checks from my personal checking account, placing them in stamped envelopes to send back on Wesley's next trip. There was a postcard from the library showing the newly remodeled children's reading room, a bright, warm space with colorful rugs and low bookshelves. It brought a small, sweet pang of pride to my chest. And then there was a handwritten letter in a pale blue envelope. The return address was written in a delicate, shaky hand. Gladys Gable, 142 Elm Street. Gladys was my next-door neighbor in town. She was 74, a widow like me, who spent her days tending her geraniums and watching the neighborhood from her front porch. She was a quiet, observant woman who had lived next to Calvin and me for 35 years. I opened the blue envelope. "Dear Sylvia," the letter began, "I hope you are keeping warm up north. The weather here has been miserable. Nothing but cold rain and gray slush. I'm writing because I thought you should know. On Wednesday afternoon, Mitchell and Teresa were at your house. They had a U-Haul trailer hitched to Mitchell's truck. They spent nearly 3 hours carrying things out of the house. I saw them take the mahogany dining room sideboard, the one Calvin's father built, and the silver tea service from the china cabinet. They also carried down several boxes from the attic, and I think they took the cedar chest from your bedroom. I walked over to ask if everything was all right, and Mitchell told me they were safekeeping your valuables because the house was empty and they were worried about break-ins. I didn't want to meddle, Sylvia, but it didn't feel right." Mitchell's tone was, well, it was very sharp, and Teresa wouldn't even look at me. "I thought you should know what was happening to your things. Let me know if you need me to look in on the house again. With love, Gladys. I sat at the pine table, the blue paper of the letter resting in my lap. Outside, a sudden draft rustled the bare branches of the birches, making a dry, whispering sound against the log walls. So they were looting the townhouse. Since they couldn't sell the property, since Roy Vance had locked the doors of my estate from the inside, they were taking what they could carry. The mahogany sideboard Mitchell had cleared his briefcase over. The silver tea service Teresa had calculated the scrap value of. The cedar chest with my wedding veil and the baby spoons. They were claiming their inheritance in advance, trying to hurt me by stripping my home of its memories. They wanted me to feel violated. They wanted me to panic, to drive 5 hours south in the slush, to call Roy Vance and demand that he file a lawsuit for theft. They wanted to drag me back into the dirt of their resentment, to force me to fight them for the clutter of my past. But as I looked around the small cabin, a strange, beautiful clarity settled over me. In this room there was no mahogany sideboard. There was only a simple pine table and 2 rocking chairs. There was no silver tea service, just my blue enamel percolator and 2 chipped ceramic mugs. There was no cedar chest, just my suitcase on the floor and Calvin's old wool jacket on the peg behind the door. And yet I had never felt richer. I had never felt safer. The things they were carrying away in their rented trailer were just wood and silver. They were the physical shells of a life I had already finished living. They could take the sideboard, but they couldn't take the Sundays we had sat around it. They could take the silver tea service, but they couldn't take the warmth of the tea I had made for Calvin. They could take the cedar chest, but the memories of my children's baby years were written in my own heart, not in the wood of a drawer. They thought they were stealing my life, but they were only taking my garbage. I pulled a sheet of writing paper from my drawer. I wrote a brief, quiet reply to Gladys. "Dear Gladys," I wrote, "thank you for your letter and for looking out for me. Please do not worry about the things Mitchell and Teresa took. They are welcome to them. The house in town is just a building, and I am perfectly safe and warm up here by the lake. Take care of your geraniums." I folded the note, placed it in an envelope, and set it with the bills. Then I wrote a short letter to Roy Vance, not to ask him to sue my children, but simply to let him know what had been taken, so he could update the trust's property inventory. I told him I had no desire to contest the removal of the furniture. I went to the wood stove, opened the heavy door, and watched the orange flames lap at the birch bark. Let them have the wood and the silver. Let them polish their stolen treasures in their cold, expensive houses. I had the lake. I had the fire. I had the winter. And they could never, as long as I lived, touch the silence I had found. By the 4th week of November, the winter had fully taken hold of the North Woods. The temperature dropped to near 0, and the ice on Lost Land Lake froze solid. It was no longer a moving, glassy, dark surface. It was a vast white plain of snow-dusted gray, stretching all the way to the far shore, where the dark pines stood like charcoal drawings against the sky. Thanksgiving Day arrived, quiet and cold. In the past, this day had been a marathon of invisible labor. My preparations would begin on Tuesday morning. Polishing the heavy silver forks, washing the crystal glasses that only came out twice a year, and peeling 5 pounds of potatoes until my thumbs were raw and pruned. On Thursday morning, I would rise at 5 to prepare the stuffing, my back aching before the sun had even cleared the trees. I would spend 12 hours on my feet in a hot, grease-scented kitchen, only to watch my family consume the entire meal in 20 minutes, leaving me with a mountain of dirty dishes while they drifted to the living room to watch television. They had never once asked if I was tired. They had never once suggested I sit down. My exhaustion was simply part of the holiday landscape, as natural and unnoted as the turkey carcass on the platter. Today, my kitchen was quiet. I didn't cook a 30-pound bird. I had bought a small Cornish game hen at the market in Hayward on Monday. I roasted it in the small cabin oven with a handful of wild rice and some dried cranberries. The scent of rosemary, butter, and wood smoke filled the warm room, a clean, gentle aroma that didn't cling to my hair or coat my skin in grease. While the hen was roasting, I put on Calvin's old plaid wool coat and walked down to the shore. The snow on the beach was deep, crunching with a dry, metallic squeak under my boots. I stopped at the water's edge, looking at the ice. It was nearly 6 inches thick now, a solid gray pavement. I took a slow, tentative step onto the frozen lake. The ice didn't creak, it didn't groan. It held my weight with an absolute, unyielding firmness. I took another step and then another, until I was 50 feet out from the shore, standing in the middle of the frozen water. I turned and looked back at the cabin. It looked small, cozy, and safe, a dark brown shape nestled against the white hills and the green-black pines. A thin, straight column of white wood smoke rose from the chimney, climbing high into the cold, still air before disappearing into the pale blue sky. I thought about my children. They would be at Teresa's house now. They would be sitting around her dining table, perhaps the very mahogany sideboard they had stolen from my house would be holding her silver platters. They would be drinking wine, talking about their jobs, their children, and their plans for the winter. And they would be talking about me. They would be telling themselves that I was a stubborn, difficult old woman who was freezing alone in the woods because I was too proud to admit my mistakes. They would be expecting the phone to ring. They would have their cell phones sitting on the table next to their wine glasses, waiting for my name to appear on the screen, ready to hear my voice break, ready to accept my surrender. But standing on the seice, the cold wind stinging my cheeks and bringing water to my eyes, I realized that I didn't feel any anger toward them. I didn't feel the sharp, burning heat of resentment that had burned itself out weeks ago, leaving only a cool, quiet ash behind. I did feel a sorrow, but it was a clean, ancient sort of grief. I didn't miss the adults they had become. The cold, calculating logistics manager who clicked his pen and counted my assets, or the bitter, ungrateful housewife who treated my life as a personal inconvenience. I had no desire to sit at their table or listen to their voices. But I did miss the children they had been. I missed the boy who had caught his first bluegill from the dock and had held it up for his father to see with eyes full of wonder. I missed the little girl who had sat on my lap in the sunroom, her hair smelling of baby shampoo, while we read about Peter Rabbit. I realized with a quiet, devastating clarity that those children had died a long time ago. They had disappeared years before Calvin did, replaced slowly, month by month and year by year, by the strangers who now carried their names and drove their expensive cars. A mother's deepest mourning is not for the children who have left her, but for the children who grew up, leaving only their bodies behind. "They're gone, Calvin," I whispered into the cold air. The wind carried my voice away over the white lake, silent and clean. I turned and walked back to the shore, my boots leaving a neat single line of tracks in the snow. I ate my Thanksgiving dinner at the small pine table by the window. Cornish was tin-tender, the wild rice hot and earthy. I ate slowly, savoring every bite, watching the sun slowly sink behind the pines on the western shore. The sky flared a brilliant cold orange before fading to a deep bruised purple, and then the first stars appeared. Tiny, diamond-sharp points of light that looked incredibly close in the freezing air. I didn't turn on the oil lamps immediately. I sat in Calvin's rocking chair by the stove, the warm red glow from the Jotul's glass door casting long, flickering shadows across the pine floorboards. The silence of the house was absolute, but it was no longer lonely. It was the silence of a house that had been cleared of its clutter. It was the silence of a woman who had finally realized that she didn't need to be needed to have a right to exist. I went to bed early, pulling the heavy wool quilts up to my chin. As I closed my eyes, the clock on the mantelpiece ticked, slow, steady, and peaceful. I was alone. But for the first time in my life, I was not lonely. By the middle of April, the great silence of the northern winter began to break. It started not with a whimper, but with a sound like thunder. I stood on the cabin porch in the pale morning light, watching the gray, honeycombed ice on Lost Land Lake split open. The deep booming roars of the cracking ice echoed across the water, a magnificent, heavy sound that shook the pine needles from the branches. It was the lake waking up, throwing off its winter armor and reclaiming its depth. The snow was melting quickly now, turning into clear, cold streams that rushed down the granite ledges to meet the lake. The first pale green shoots of the wild ferns were beginning to push their heads through the wet, brown carpet of fallen pine needles. On Tuesday afternoon, my phone, which I now kept in the kitchen drawer, turned off unless I wanted to use it, vibrated twice. It was Roy Vance. Sylvia. His voice was warm, carrying the steady, reassuring weight of a spring breeze. "I thought you should know. Mitchell's attorney called my office this morning. They have officially withdrawn their petition for a cognitive evaluation." I leaned against the pine door frame, looking out at the glittering water. "Did they?" "Yes," Roy said, and I could hear the quiet satisfaction in his voice. The probate judge made it clear in chambers that he was going to dismiss the filing immediately. Your medical records from Dr. Mercer were perfectly clear, and Mitchell realized that continuing to fight would mean spending a significant amount of his own money on legal fees with absolutely zero chance of success. "They're done, Sylvia. They've backed off. The trust is completely secure." "Thank you, Roy," I said softly, "for everything." "You don't have to thank me, Sylvia," he said quietly. "You're the one who stood your ground. I just drew the lines. Have a beautiful spring up there." "I will," I said. I hung up the phone and walked out onto the porch. I sat in the rocking chair, a cup of fresh coffee in my hand, and looked at the lake. The ice was nearly gone now, leaving only a few white drifts floating like ghost ships near the western shore. The water was a deep, brilliant blue, reflecting the vast, clear sky. My children had stopped calling. They had stopped texting. The silence of their exile was now complete. A permanent border they had drawn between their lives and mine. They had kept the mahogany sideboard, the silver tea service, and the cedar chest. They had placed them in their clean, expensive suburban homes, believing they had carried away the valuable parts of our family's history. But as the warm spring sun beat down on my face, I knew they were wrong. They would sit at that mahogany table on Thanksgiving, and they would look at that silver tea service on Christmas, but they would find no warmth in them. They would slowly realize as the years went on, and the winters grew longer, that the piece of their childhood wasn't written in the wood or the metal. It had been written in the invisible, endless labor of the mother they had chosen not to see. And that labor had ended the moment I stepped onto the highway. They had spent decades waiting for my life to become their inheritance, never understanding that a mother only truly disappears when she finally decides to keep herself. I took a slow sip of my coffee. The air was sweet with the scent of wet pine and damp earth, the clean, honest smell of a new beginning. I was 71 years old. My hair was white, my hands were spotted with age, and my knees still popped in the cold. But as I watched the dark water of Lost Land Lake ripple under the gentle spring wind, I knew I was whole. I was no longer a ghost in my own kitchen. I was a woman, sitting in the sun, listening to the lake breathe. I leaned my head back against the warm pine logs of the cabin, closed my eyes, and let the rocking chair move, slow, steady, and entirely at peace.